I'm going to start talking about today. What we're looking at is looking at impact of peer research and embedding participation. So that last bit, we covered how you do the design, the analysis, the fieldwork, recruitment, remuneration. We covered a lot, and now this is the final bit, thinking about once that research has been done, once the work of the analysis has been done, once you might have recommendations, how do you actually create impact from it? The first one is to talk about what the challenges of impact, right? It's always seen as one of the hardest pieces, and there's a range of reasons. Generally, it is the most common point of failure within peer research, and there's a whole wide gamut, like lack of funding, lack of stakeholder engagement from the outset. Lots of projects don't necessarily have a long impact phase put in. They might put a month or two to do some influencing activities, but kind of doing that longitudinal stuff can be really, really tricky. And we kind of see there's three main categories where impact is challenging. First, you find insights without action, and this is the most common one, where it's that we don't want to do research for research's sake, but if we don't have adequate preparation in terms of the impact, then that's what happens. You have findings that launch an event, you've got decision makers who might come in or listen to the findings, but there is no concrete commitment for anything, and the research becomes a problem statement, like a mapping or analysis of what the challenges are, but no feasible path to influencing or impact. The second one is action without legacy. So you'll have a really successful one-off project that has impact, that might have young people doing things, might take young people engaging with the community, but it doesn't have that long-term funding cycle. So it'll be a one-off for 1 year. One space or green space is created, but there's no ongoing legacy of maintenance. And it doesn't really kind of prioritize or capture a lot of the things that have been built during that 1 year, right? So it doesn't have a legacy. That 1 year, and when it's got program funding, is really impactful, but doesn't continue. The third one is kind of legacy without quality, where, and this is particularly when we're looking at embedding participation, where it becomes a permanent feature. So you do one, for example, great piece of peer research in the first year, and then you start to embed it to do every single year. But as a result, every single year, while it has that legacy, it starts to kind of weaken in terms of funding or capacity or the support given to it. The rigor and the ethics might slightly adrift, and then you start to go from a fully fledged peer research project in which you recruited a cohort with that lived experience, and it evolves kind of into a more traditional youth advisory board or a youth council, and it doesn't quite fit peer research anymore. It becomes a more traditional youth voice structure. So that's what happens. You see that conversion into that as well. I mean, generally what practitioners are here to, and this is across all of the types of impact we're talking about, the first one is just holding the line on action, having that plan for action from day one. We've talked about that when we're looking at the research design. How do you involve stakeholders and map them throughout the course of it? What are the opportunities you're trying to influence? Generally, peer research works if it's being done in response to something coming up, like you've got the curriculum review or 16, or there's a strategic opportunity within the local authority. And how do practitioners hold the line to do that, right, rather than young people? Brokering the right rooms, this works particularly well within local authorities. Who are the people, who are the commissioners, who are the decision makers internally that those peer researchers can engage with them? And it's not just getting young people in front of practitioners, but it's how do you do that work with practitioners and decision makers and prepare them so they are ready to kind of have a collaborative conversation with young people that leads to something. I think it's thinking about the legacy intentionally, and obviously this comes down to budget and capacity, but it's always nice to think about things in longer time frames. So even if you have a year cycle, think about what it would look like as a project if you had that 2 years, and thinking about what that legacy would look like, and if you did get institutional buy-in, what happens, right? We've seen projects very often do a first year, it's fantastic, that's what they plan for, and then suddenly all the decision makers in charge or leadership or strategic leadership goes, actually this is really good, what are you going to do next? And then they give them more funding, and then they're slightly off foot because they haven't actually thought about what it looks like in year 2 as well. Next one is to hold the research of wellbeing. Thought really much about that within fieldwork, but it looks very different in terms of impact. Now you're entering more a different kind of risk in terms of political risk, legacy risk, sometimes social action, going out into the streets, and then protecting that rigorous participation grows. And what you tend to see the impact is the scope widens in terms of the number of young people involved in it, and that presents other risks. Peer research group, you might have 5 or 6, they have some key findings, you go to a social action phase, and then you might involve 30 young people in the social action phase, right? So it starts to kind of grow in scale and comes with its own kind of ethics and sampling and answers challenges. The first thing we're going to talk about is co-designing output. So even before we get to the impact side of it, we talked about analysing key findings and recommendations, but the format in which you actually output your research and how the young people are involved in that, I think really matters depending on what the sort of impact you're looking at, what the stakeholders are that you're targeting. There are kind of 2 key ones. We talk about traditional outputs, which is the stuff like reports, briefings, policy papers, which can be really strong to funders, commissioners, academics, really good at going into detail as well for practitioners who want that level of granularity and numbers. I think the challenge is it can be really accessible for young people, so that closing the loop. You cannot just do it with traditional outputs alone. It requires a degree of literacy. Somebody reports me 30, 40 pages, there has to be a realistic expectation that people are going to read it for you to do all of that work, especially stuff like published data sets. If you're going to be doing those published data sets, do people have that data literacy to use it in their own work or inform practice with it? And then the non-traditional outputs, right, which is the stuff that traditionally more young people are really excited by: exhibitions, signs, podcasts, films, videos, infographics, experiences, public events. This is stuff where young people can really reach a wider public. It has that emotional weight. It can build their skills outside of research as well. If they're interested in video or creative stuff, that really feeds into it. I would say non-traditional outputs are a lot more expensive as well, right, compared to doing a report. It's really hard to evidence with funders, and the impact of it can be really difficult to trace back. And also, it generally isn't in the format that a lot of decision makers are interested in, right? And that's a limitation of quant versus qual. But surveys with graphs, with high numbers, with a detailed report, partnered with the university, tends to have more influence than a design or a podcast or a film. So it really depends on who you're looking for. But non-traditional outputs, fantastic in terms of closing the loop. So we had a project which was in Merton, came up with a 40-page report, which went to commissioners, people who worked at the local authority, with all the numbers on it. But then the peer researchers, based on the findings of the research, did a short 3-minute video with interviews with young people speaking to the deans, and then that video was played in every single secondary school that had participated in the survey, right? So it's not either or, it's thinking about how do they complement each other, which ones do you need for which specific stakeholders, and also allocation of budget, right? Like how important is the traditional one, how much of that proportion of the budget in terms of outputs does it take? In terms of the anatomy of the research report, which is kind of the basics people at least tend to do, we always go by introduction, methodology, key findings, recommendations, and then the findings in detail, right, as chapter headings. And it's a question about which ones do peer researchers write. Sometimes you see reports where peer researchers will just do a wider introduction as a group, which is just one peer researcher and everyone signs off on it. You've got other ones where you have a introduction to each chapter written by a peer researcher. I would say the methodology is one thing where it has to be co-written, because I think you as a practitioner will have a little bit additional insight in terms of what you did as an organisation to design that participatory approach and things that the peer researchers were involved in, like recruitment, potentially consent and safeguarding, and all those sides. Key findings recommendations, we try and wholly have them either written by young people and then just edited by us, or designed by young people in terms of their exact wording. But again, it's kind of a changeable thing, right? So if they do key findings and recommendations, we always recommend that they do stakeholder engagement, and stakeholders give feedback, and the young people may take that on as well. So it's kind of a continual co-produced process as well. And then findings and details. So you can do introductions written by them. We worked with one project at in Islington where the young people wholly wrote each chapter of the key findings. So the theme about transport was written by one peer researcher, which is really, really good. The challenges of that, it was just really inconsistent in terms of theme and tone. Like you could tell who wrote what one by their writing, right? And either that's a strength and you embrace that, or you end up having to do a really big copy edit job. Also, it takes a lot of time, right? Especially if your young people aren't thinking about going into university and academic field or whatever it is. It's a really big task to write a research report. But it's always about thinking about how are the young people meaningfully inputting in each section of the report as well, rather than just an introduction at the top. So this one, they did an introduction for each section, so methodology was written by Gian as well, and what was quite nice is we tried to get their quotes and their insights across all of it. So if there was a section written up about transport, it would be the practitioner writing up just the facts, the data, the numbers, what does it say, what was the inference and qualitative, but there'd be a little box from one of the peer researchers specifically talking about that data point, right? And that's a really easy activity that you can do with young people once you've done the key findings recommendations. You know, what's your favourite key finding, or what's the key finding that surprised you most, and can you write a paragraph about why it surprised you most, right? It's not just thinking about the instructions, about how you can get little snippets of writing and their insight and their experiences and how they relate to it in the back. So when you come to write the report, you can slip in all of those things across it as well, so they are present constantly throughout it rather than just an introduction. In terms of their participation through outputs, the first thing I would always say is it needs their full authorship, right? Having them named as a co-author, their words, their identity, it's non-negotiable, but it's about how you do that, right, in a designed way and giving them credit for it. We've seen this especially when pieces of peer research are published in academic journals. It's about them being named as authors on that alongside the academics who supported it. Joint or individual instructions, I talked about it, and again, all of these things need to be budgeted for because they need to be paid to write all of these things and specific chapters. Writing key sections, so, just getting to write one specific data point or one specific finding. One way that it works is getting the young people to write specifically the qualitative side. So me as a practitioner, I'll write up just what the data says, what the graph says, but then if there's a focus group, we get the young person who conducts that focus group to write up their experience and what they found from the young people, right? It depends. There's ranges of ways of doing it, but being really core and conscious about how long it's going to take if you have the budget for them to do it, and then assigning those roles and responsibilities with a timeline, so it's all in time. Writing the entire report, you do it, it's really, really, really tiring, and then designing the report as well. In terms of guidelines to pay, it really varies. We're not giving you a golden standard. We pay London living wage for every piece of work that they do, and we put them on salary. It really differs though. Some people do £10 an hour, some people may do less, especially we see people do less than £10 an hour or no payment if they're an organisation that provides a service, and then they can justify by saying that they did provide them a service in lieu, like access to this or free sports club membership or whatever it is. It really, really varies. I mean, that's why we say remuneration rather than payment. It's about judgment of that organisation about what is fair and what the young people want, and it also depends where they are in life as well. In terms of designing a report as well, that's the basic stuff. So for like the centrifuge voice, really basic example, we asked young people to design the logos and choose the colour scheme. I personally don't like the colour purple, but it's the one that all the young people chose, and I think it looks quite nice now. It's grown on me. But just the basic stuff, right? Like brand identity, colour palettes, imagery. We had one report where all of the images, the young people went out and then they took all the pictures, right? So every single picture on the report comes from them as well, not just a research day. Getting them to meet with the designer so they can have a say on all those things. I think generally people do that when it comes to like zines or zines, I don't know how to pronounce it, and non-traditional outputs, but actually all of that creative co-production stuff should also happen in traditional reports. It just rarely does because most organisations already have an established template or a designer and they just drop it into it, right? So it's easier, but it's a really missed opportunity in where young people can co-produce. This is one about how you display the peer researchers, right? Individual pictures, their mission group, having them front and foremost. Not all young people want to be pictured in it as well. But my colleague does this, where she took pictures from all of them, and every single thing she does, every single meeting, every single thing, she talks about them first and foremost as the authors and as the key drivers of this report. It's a really good thing to do consistently. Second one is briefings. I mean, briefings are a little bit shorter than those reports, right? Those 2 or 4 page outputs if you don't want to do a full report. And what's really nice about them is you can tailor them to who you're actually trying to target, right? So MPs and councillors, really good to have a short 2-3 report with a really clear narrative from the peer researchers and specific asks. You can tailor the recommendations as well, depending on who you're going to, and you can hold those roles and responsibilities. So one peer researcher is responsible for the briefings that are going out to participation workers with the ask participation workers, and another one's going out to schools. And you can bring far more authentic voice, right? Because it's only a 2 or 4 page piece. It becomes more realistic in terms of capacity for the peer researchers to hold that far more in terms of the writing the entire brief, designing the entire brief, and then also writing the output in terms of emailing out and things like that. That's way more effective. So what we've seen in certain reports is organisation practitioner will do that big 30-40 page reports, and then the peer researcher will be responsible for the 2 to 4 page output, of which will form the basis of their outreach and influencing activities afterwards. And then lastly, infographics as well. So we talk about infographics as a visual metaphor. I'm kind of used to that with like pictures, percentages, and all those things. And it kind of represents the feeling, not just the numbers. So we always think about infographics as numbers and percentages, but it's also like what sort of images they choose, what icons they choose can really convey the tone of the research or what they're trying to achieve as a result. Like, is it a positive thing or a negative thing or whatever it is? You can also bring in exact quotes and words on what they want to say, and also you can show the work being done far more. People always think about infographics as like icons and just percentages, but you can also almost like combine it with a bit of a journey map, right? Showing images of the process and the work that's happened as it went along. Also far more accessible. Young people can choose the language, and generally visualizations for closing loop purposes are far better if young people can see them and see what came off. And then also it's a nice one to co-design with designers as well. And that's why I would say I would get young people to do infographics. It's a really difficult thing to do. Canva is accessible, but it's still quite a challenging thing. So getting them to co-design it rather than writing infographics themselves. So this is a really good example from a Healthy London Partnership. We're kind of used to it, especially within medical research, numbers, impact, graphics. But you can do more than just key findings. It could also be the recommendations. You could have a section of your infographics about methodology, how many young people you spoke to, how many minutes were the interviews, right? Well, that's one that I really like. Instead of saying 6 interviews, you exactly total up the minutes. You spoke to 6 young people lasting over 125 minutes or whatever it is. It's a way of breaking down the research and presenting it in a different, more engaging way. And then lastly, I'll talk about all of these in one. There's so much here, right? But non-traditional outputs. So exhibitions and installations, especially have creative research. So Here Action Collective did a photo exhibition on youth violence, which toured around England. And it also allows young people to play that role of curating as well. What's the first thing that people see? What's the last piece of art that people see when they come out? Do we accompany it with words or whatever it is? And it's a really kind of interesting, nice example to do. And it can be accompanied with traditional stuff, right? So you can have reports or briefings or whatever it is at the exhibitions for people to read as they go along. Zines and printed media. I'm less familiar with Zines, but there are some really good examples, especially if you Google peer research and Zines. And that's particularly a good way at closing the loop, but also as a research purpose, right? People create Zines as a research activity. And again, it's about what people choose to put in the design, what images they choose to bring in, or who they want to interview, whatever it is. So design is a bit of a strange one where it's both the research output and the research itself, if that makes sense. Podcast and audio, yeah, people love doing podcasts. It depends on how far you're going to reach it, who's going to listen to it. I think there's some really practical considerations when it comes to podcast, audio, and video. Young people are always really, really up for it, but I think the practitioner's role is not just thinking about, do we have the capacity and budget to do this correctly, but do we have the reach organizationally to mean this podcast or video piece is actually going to be seen, because you don't want to put all of this work into something that's only going to be listened to about 20, 30 young people. So again, it depends on the reach. Bernardo's Do See Here is one podcast series with peer researchers as the hosts. That works really well because they're a big national organization and they get enough people to listen to it. And then lastly, film, theatre and performances. Yeah, again, this is a bit like design where the performance is not just the output, but also the research itself. There was a really good piece on looking at the mental health barriers to getting mental health support for older people in the Caribbean community in North East London. And the way in which they went about that, they took an intergenerational approach and they brought in a grandchild of that person, and they got the grandchild to tout a kind of small theatre vignette where they played the role of their grandparent being asked to go to mental health support. And they had to, one, do an impression of their grandparent, which is always funny, but two, the grandparent got to see, react, and discuss the perception of why their grandchild thought they didn't want to go, if that makes sense, right? So they got to see the fact that they thought their grandchildren thought they were stubborn, or they got to explore generational attitudes about speaking about mental health or distrust about medical professions, right? But it was a really interesting kind of theatrical piece as well, and you could 100% put that on and show that to demonstrate the point as case studies as well. And then film showings is real, especially with larger organizations like NSPCC. They did Voices of the Future short film series, which is quite interesting and really works well on social media. So this was Know Your Roots, which did a online gallery exhibition as well, which provided the context, which was looking at, I mean, they had all these wonderful archive photos and images from Black Londoners from the Victorian era, right, which was kind of an underseen part of London life, and then getting young people today to kind of recreate some of those images as well. But it was all online, right, so it doesn't also have to be a physical space. It could also be a gallery and exhibition. And I encourage you to Google Know Your Roots as well. All of the images, all the collages are up there as well, and you can kind of go through that and look at that. And it's just a website dedicated to all those images, like gallery. This is from a zine as well, where they made a physical zine where they actually physically copied and cut out and stuck things together. Then they scanned it all in and distributed it larger as a zine. And this is what I mean by it both being the research and the research output as well. But it's really nice because even within the scan, it retains that kind of physical kind of aspect to it. You can see the work that's gone into it. You can see how young people have physically cut up these things and decided and placed and stuff. So as I said, it's about matching those outputs to the audiences, right? So if your audience is commissioners and funders, I mean, this is all stereotyped, right? And this is kind of general rules, but this is general about commissioners and funders. They care about evidence-based and methodology and return on investments, and they want full reports and graphs and all of these things. And again, it's not all true, right? Some commissioners and funders are really moved by kind of creative stuff or really interesting approaches. It depends on the commissioner, it depends on the funder, but as a general rule. Politicians, MPs, councillors and mayors, headline asks, named constituents, photo opportunities is the stereotype, but generally they are really effective if the peer researchers are doing that direct outreach themselves, especially as a young resident living in the area, talking about the work they've done. The MPs and councillors don't want to hear from us working at a local authority or a charity. They really want to hear from that young people, especially if the young people said, I've gone out and spoken to X number of young people in the area as well. But everything for elected officials, very short and snappy, as we know, especially campaign fields and things like that. Frontline practitioners, and this is thinking about the recommendations, but not just the recommendations for decision makers, which is the long and medium term stuff, but what are the short term recommendations, right? And how do you get buy-in from them throughout the process? So once the research output's actually out, then it actually shifts to this practical co-design and co-delivery stage, right? Where the peer researchers can either be presenters, where they present findings and what they want to do, or they can be trainers, or they can do kind of more long-term legacy work, right? Where we had one project where the peer researchers came up with recommendations, and then 6 months after that, they spent 6 months supporting a couple of the staff at the local authority to co-design the delivery of one of the practical changes that spoke to the recommendations, right? So it's that continued work of actually delivering. Other young people, so young people, I think the main way to do it is making sure that findings feel relevant, taking action, alerting them to any social action opportunities as well. But yeah, it's mostly the closing the loop thing. And in terms of the wider public, very rarely does peer research do this. National charities tend to do it. Depends on what the purpose is, but it's raising awareness, challenging an issue, and all of that stuff's around emotional connections. And the non-traditional stuff around exhibitions, theatre pieces work really well for that as well. Just 6 common pitfalls in terms of the output. We always say that peer researchers are illustrators, not authors, so they might add a quote or a photo, but they don't have co-authorship over it. And again, it depends what co-authorship looks like. Generally, if you don't think your peer researchers are in a space, you don't have the capacity for them to do a fully co-authored report, then maybe just think about not doing a report to that extent and thinking about what output you could do within the constraints that you have, that young people could have far more work to do on or to participate with. This always happens designed for funders only, where reports mostly go out to funders, report back to them. I also think the other thing happens where loads of research projects, they do something for the funders, like impact report or whatever, and then it goes nowhere else, right? And actually, you have to do something for the funder as well. Think about how you can repurpose it or change it to make it for another stakeholder or for the public consumption, whatever it is, right? If you're doing that work anyway. Another one's outputs always get unfinished at the launch, so you might launch the report, but the recommendations are still being edited, or you haven't quite secured a pathway for there to be impact. It's always nice to kind of launch the report with clear commitments and asks already in place, rather than trying to secure it at the time. So then you can go, here's the research, this is what they've done, here's the key findings, here's the recommendation, and now here's the person from the council talking about what they're going to do in the next 6 months, or here's the person from the funder who's going to talk about the money or the small micro grants program or whatever it is, right? Already do these outputs and think about what that impact is even before the launch. Next one's a simple one, no remuneration, and this just becomes about planning, right? Where there is not funding for peer researchers to continue doing influencing work, and it's really tricky because you don't know what traction you're going to get. You might plan for 2 months of influencing work, and then actually, there might be a stakeholder who's super engaged with it and wants to continue working with the peer researcher over 3, 4, 5 months, and then you don't have the remuneration for them, and they end up volunteering or whatever it is. Another one is one output, no fallback. This always happens where organisations just do a report and then it just doesn't have the impact that it needs, or they just do a podcast and then it doesn't have stuff for commissioners as well. So really, again, a combination of traditional, non-traditional, or 2 traditionals, a report and a briefing, just have more than one output, so you've got fallback. And then lastly, findings that change in the writing. And this happens quite a lot, where there's somewhere between translation and the analysis phase, key finding stage, and the report writing, it changes in terms of language, right? Where you as a practitioner will soften the recommendations based on the commissioner, you'll go too far listening to the feedback from stakeholders against what the young people want to be in it. So it is making sure that they are really involved in proofreading, checking everything that's being written, and then I think directly asking, right? Because I think it's really difficult with the power relationship for young people unprompted to go, you've changed that and that's not what I want. So it is really asking them constantly and creating that space for them to be able to say that they feel like this needs to be stumbled that, does this speak to what you originally said? Is this reflective of what you wanted, right? Like directly asking. There are a range of examples of peer research efforts. I'm not going to go into them all. Young Women's Trust have a fantastic example of a zine or zine, which reached 2.4 million people. We talked about NSBCC's short film. Peer Action Collective do briefings, films, and a parliamentary launch as well, a whole range of things. Place to Be did peer evaluation. They had some creative outputs as well, and each school retained and did that co-production thing. And then Bernardo did See Here Respond, which is those podcasts, especially during COVID, which is a good idea. So those are kind of the outputs, thinking about the sort of things that people do as a result of peer research, but it really depends on what your route of impact is and what kind of impact you are expecting to have. And you should know that from day one in terms of the scale of the project and who you're recruiting and all of those sides. 5 routes of impact generally, and there are others, but just trying to roughly group them for simplicity. The first is influence, and we always say the word influence, but what does it actually look like? It's changing directly what decision makers do, either through evidence or their presence or just one-to-one interactions or pressure, which is targeted at policy change, commissioning, and then actual practice, right? And this can be internally within your organisation, or it could be externally with a local authority or a funder or another charity or whatever it is. And that one is probably the hardest to prove because stuff like policy commissioning are really long processes, and sometimes it will be cited, your report or your research, as the reason why they've done it, which is really direct link, but otherwise it's much harder unless you have that longitudinal funding to do interviews with decision makers and hear in their words about how the work that you did influenced that work. Co-design is a little bit easier, right? Because it's so much easier to demonstrate their involvement. Young people actually, on the back of doing the work, support the reshaping of a service or design or a program. There is additional work to be done. This is really nicely seen in cycles as well. So when you do 1 year of research and then 1 year of designing or doing some co-design or co-delivery, right, where they directly take on those experiences and go on. It doesn't quite work when you see like a year for a peer research project and then 2 months for a co-design process, right? It feels a little bit tacked on. And a full co-design, and I'll talk about co-delivery as well, both of those processes take as long as a peer research process to do properly. So that's why a sort of cyclical approach works really well. Co-delivery is where young people go on the back of the research and then actually take an active role in doing some sort of service or delivery. So when they do mentoring roles, peer trainers, they become peer practitioners. We saw one project where the peer research yielded that young people want more supported structured mentoring, and then the year after that it was all about them co-designing the mentoring process and then becoming peer mentors as well. So really directly leading to that impact and being responsible for the impact. The peer researchers were the ones doing the impact as well. There was no external influencing needed. They just had an idea and were supported to deliver it. The next one's funding, and this happens with some projects built in where, for example, Peer Action Collective will have specific funding reserved for the change makers in year 2. If there is an impact pot as well, you'll see this a lot with non-peer research funding, right? Where you'll have like 4 grants given out and they'll do a year of exploratory work, and in the second year, 2 of them will get additional impact funding to deliver it, right? But it's thinking about that, but within the peer research process, right? So you'll have a small pot of funding for young people to deliver something, whether that's co-design, co-delivery, social action, doing some sort of community action work, but you don't do it for all of their recommendations. You go, look, if you've got 5 recommendations, we'll choose one thing that you want to do, and that's what the impact pot will go into. If you're within a local authority, you can see peer researchers and the peer research itself going towards a participatory budgeting or participatory grant making, and then you're kind of mixing or fusing peer research with more like young commissioners and other different types of participatory budgeting and grant making. And then last one's social action. And this is kind of a bit of a catch-all for stuff that doesn't clearly need to. Social action be anything really, right? It's just young people acting on it themselves. It doesn't even need to be peer researchers. You can have a social action phase that recruits more widely. This is anything with campaigning, public-facing stuff, community organising, mutual aid. It could be like going and doing some gardening. It's like anything where it's young people going out and doing action. It's the most direct route. You're not waiting for other people. You're not waiting for any influencing. But it is probably the most resource capacity heavy, right? Because you're not relying on other people's pots of funding or other people's power and decision-making. It's young people actually having to go out there and do the work to make change themselves. So firstly, in terms of influencing, I'll be quite quick, there's a few of them. It's about who holds that decision, who's the specific people you're going for. But I think sometimes we always think about specific people, and I think it's a lot easier to do that, especially with young people, to communicate, hey, this person runs head of this, and he is responsible for this, or she can deliver this, and therefore you need to speak to them. Actually, it's also thinking about the structure and the systems, right? And we see this a lot in London, where young people may want to change one thing, and then they don't have that civic engagement or education at school, so they don't know who's responsible for what. So you already have to do that piece, being like, this is TfL, this is the Mayor of London's remit, this is the local authority's remit. So it's about how do you influence specific structures, opportunities, strategies, and the cycle of processes, right? Like understanding, for example, a local authority and when strategic plans are coming up, or when a local plan is coming up to its end, or when there's an influencer, do the London plan, all these strategies are 2024, 2028. Being conscious of all of those life cycles of those different things, and then how do you pitch in research or time it so it influences that? The next one is the specific decision, right? What's the actual thing, the guideline or specific word or specific document that you're doing? Just kind of raising awareness isn't necessarily, it's good, but it's not it's not an effective one. It's more like being a scalpel and thinking about what's that specific decision or specific thing that we're trying to influence. And then again, it's the timeline. So it's the strategy review, the budget cycle, and really importantly, local authority inspection as well. So map the evidence in that window and make sure all the timings are right? Which can be really tricky because you're already like juggling timelines with young people's exam periods and all of this side of it. But it's just another thing from day one to think about what does this timeline of this work looks like, who are the stakeholders we're engaging, and what are their key dates that we need to be conscious of to do, right? And sometimes you might have to do more work, right? So we're talking about the end of a project. You might find that there's a really good opportunity, but they're going to be like just done with their fieldwork phase. Then what some projects will do is do an interim report as well, right? So what's the stuff that we can gather for this specific timeline date, even though we're not fully ready for the full research output? It's thinking about that and charting that along the timeline. So you've got influencing opportunities throughout, right? And that goes back to the same thing of how do we engage stakeholders at every single part of it? How can we also provide outputs as much as we can along the way as well to link up with their cycles? So there's realistic and aspirational influence, and the realistic influence is always that project scale side of it, and that's the short-term, medium-term, long-term wins, and it's always about having a mix of it. But peer research we find works really well when it's hyper-local or hyper-specific on a lived experience or community. So therefore that project scale stuff works probably really well when you're looking at specific school changes or a local authority as a young person commissioning panel or kind of continues the work of designing something. It's a charity and how you're changing internal structures or the way that you deliver something. That's why peer evaluation works really well sometimes. It might not be the most engaging thing for young people because evaluation is less interesting than kind of make a zine or something, but it's always the most effective in terms of change because young people directly see the changes made to a service as a result of their evaluation, service tweaks and things like that. This is the stuff that can be done in 12 to 18 months, and this is stuff that almost can be guaranteed. either because you have a really good relationship and it's a small ask, or you're doing stuff internally about services you already deliver and it's something where you have a suspicion that this needs to change, and then the young people are just helping you kind of push that forward. Then there's a lot of aspirational stuff which is really challenging, right? And I think most peer research projects do aim for this, even though they don't necessarily have the ability to fulfill it. And I think that's just naturally because that's what young people are super interested in, right? Like they are super interested in, for example, and this is hypothetical, I'm not thinking about anything, but if young people are looking at police reform, right, and they have a problem with stop and search or an issue like that, they're a small charity from a small youth club and they have a really, really critical piece about the police, but that youth club has no relationship with police or influence with policing people in the local authority, right? Then that becomes a really tricky thing for them to do. So it's really about what those existing relationships are like. And also, both of these things take ages, right? Legislation changes take ages and ages and ages. And young people aren't around for years. They've got to university, they'll move places, they're highly, highly mobile, especially in London. It just moves too quickly. Not to say you shouldn't have that, but it's the balance between both, right? So influencing strategies, generally one-to-one meetings, that always really works quite well, especially now that everyone is online and on Zoom. In-person stuff works really well. 30-minute meetings. We had one project where it was all the directors, about 5 of the directors, met 5 of the peer researchers. It wasn't this big event with 30 or 40 people, it's just 5 people meeting 5 people, but it was the key people in charge of that decision-making, and the buy-in after the project went really, really well. So really it's about building those relationships one-on-one. There's co-presented launch events as well, so if you had to do a larger event, how do you get peer research to present to that as well, hold that, chair those group discussions. But again, it's helpful for a first step, but also for regular stakeholder engagement. Parliamentary committee meetings, this is tricky, different organisations have different results for it. There is a real mixed effectiveness of influencing, say, APPGs, partly because you can have an APPG about anything and it can be funded by anything. So yeah, but it's a really good experience for the young people. I'm not sure about the influence, but for young people, it's a really good experience. They get really good skills. They get to talk to MPs or go to Parliament and stuff like that. Really, really good. But I think it's better if you build up over multiple projects. We have one project who every single year does about peer research about care leavers, young people in care, and as a result, they built up national relationships with people doing the leaving care review and stuff like that. And then they become so it was a relationship built up over time. Media and op-eds as well. We do get young people being asked to do trade press, children, young people now, national press, talk about housing stuff as well. Really, really good. Generally, media sources love to hear from young people talking about their own stuff, so that does work. But most organisations don't have those relationships, which can be tricky to kind of just send press releases out into the ether. Coalition with sector bodies works quite well as well, especially if you can find a national organisation that still speaks to the themes and what you're looking at, and repeat evidence as well. So we've had peer research projects where they will repeat it over multiple years, and then they'll expand a little bit with some co-design elements, but actually they'll start to keep a lot of it consistent as well. And then actually you get a repeated kind of baseline of evidence, right? So now you can do like 4 years of peer evaluation, and this is how it's changed over time. So this was a co-launch where the peer researchers launched all of their events at LSE cities. They also had the head of Islington Council talk, some of the academics from LSE, and it was really, really good, right? Because they could talk about their findings directly with policymakers, but they could also speak directly one-to-one to the leader of the council and things like that, where it's not a recorded interview or whatever, and it's that kind of one-to-one relationship and influencing. This is one of the young people, Tanisha, going to one of the APPGs, talking about apprenticeships as well, which was a really, really fantastic experience. And you do get to speak to MPs who are doing this work anyway, so it's a good opportunity to feed the evidence that you're collecting into that. The thing I would say is impact tracking, if you have the capacity to do it, is thinking about spreadsheets. We love a spreadsheet. Who are the decisions, what do they say, what was asked, follow up, and the status of it, and then also assigning roles and responsibilities. So each young person knows who they need to kind of contact with. I think this is generally what practitioners do anyway, but getting young people to be responsible for that as well and having designated leads, it just helps with building that relationship and making sure that things don't just die or disappear. This also happens if people move jobs and then change. How do you make sure that this is picking that up? Route 2 is that co-design period. How do you co-design with young people? Got a bunch of time, so I'll be quick. Findings becoming design constraints, and that's the really tricky thing where the research outputs are these giant kind of thing, they're inspirational and they're not design brief. So what happens if you have co-design too far in mind, then the recommendations of the key findings become less aspirational, they become more project based, if that makes sense, and then it kind of shifts the power relationship where they're thinking too practically and too practitioner based. Making sure young people stay in the room, so you don't just hand over to a co-design group, they are actively part of it. Not all of them have to be involved, but 1 or 2 of peer researchers for that continuity. Thinking about the granularity of it as well, getting people to test things out. So it's not just the language specifically, but it's also like actual things that cost money, like opening hours or redesign, additional staff. Bringing delivery, if you want to co-design something, and that's one of the ambitions in the beginning, again, just bringing them in from the start so they can also have a say in terms of stakeholder engagement, and the plan for iteration, right? So if they co-design anything, it's not going to be perfect first time. So how do you have that process built in? The peer researchers go back, test it, make adjustments, and it isn't just a let's try and get it right the first time. So we talk about where the young people do it. So with peer research, they kind of discover, they define, and then it moves to a co-design process, which is develop and deliver. And again, they are separate things. There'll be whole projects, which is only just a co-design process, right? But it's about, again, that fusion between a peer research process and when you're coming to create impact, how do you then continue in a participatory way with co-design or co-delivery or participatory batch making, whatever it is, right? So this is one example where peer researchers did an analysis of Northwick Park, where they spoke to healthcare professionals and young people in Northwick Park Hospital A&E, and it was about youth violence and mental health and things like that. Really good peer research process. But then what young Harrow did on the basis of that is they brought together a range of partners from health and youth sector and thought about what one of those interventions based on what it could be. And what the young people kind of thought about is having a youth worker within A&E to support young people who are suspected of being there through youth violence or whatever it is to get them at that critical point. And again, it's a really tricky thing, loads of safeguarding, risks there, so it had to be a really considered co-design process. So those peer researchers who initially did the research were really heavily involved in the design, commission, delivery of that project. So from research to the first youth worker being in A&E, I think it was about 3 or 4 years between that, right? So those young people had to continue to support that design process as well. So feasibility gaps are always the biggest ones. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's the budget as well. Telling the peer researchers the day one what the budget is and how much month it is, and being respectful of their time and making sure you're not going over that. Having decision makers in the workshops again, so they are there also in the design, field work, and things like that. So there's item on it. Document why certain ideas were dropped, especially if there's recommendations that didn't go well. Not just having a silent veto on it. And again, it's about being respectful of young people, treating them like peers and equals, and saying, look, this recommendation probably won't work out for X number of reasons, and having a discussion about it, and ultimately they have final say. But it's not just quietly doing things for practical reasons. And then building iteration days as well. So making sure that you're scheduling kind of a check-in 6 weeks after the workshop or whatever it is, just so when you're doing that co-design process, you have regular check-ins. So it's not just like a workshop with young people and the design team go away and doing it. Young people constantly involved, almost like a steering group and coming together. Next one's co-design with young people's practitioners. There's a range of doing peer mentors, peer trainers, peer evaluators, peer ambassadors. It's where they move from a peer researcher role where they are being valued for their lived experience as a young person, and now they are moving to a practitioner role where they are valued based on their experience as a researcher, right? It's kind of one step beyond. And this can be young people, delivering a toolkit or a resource that they've designed as a result. It's training practitioners about what they found and talking about sensibility or accessibility or whatever it is. It could be mentors as well. So they've identified the gap and what young people need, and they design a process where they are the ones going through that. And we see this really informally happening anyway. You'll see loads of peer researchers, continue to do either work in the youth sector or they'll go on to get a youth work qualification and become a youth worker for that club or organization. So it happens informally. It's about how do you build it into the structured process of code delivery, right? You also have peer evaluators where they've got that research experience. I think with all of code delivery, it's about recognizing the skills that those young people are going to get as a part of that peer researcher role. And it's not necessarily getting them to do research every single year as a cyclical thing. It's having opportunities for them to utilize those skills in other ways to deliver for young people, right? And peer mentoring is a great one because they will develop confidence and ability to speak to young people and to agree leadership and teamwork. And it's just applying that on a practical basis, like on the ground, supporting other young people. And then peer ambassadors is a big one as well, where it moves more to like a youth voice structure, except they're more informed by the research, and it becomes more like an advocacy work where they're talking to Parliament and it's ongoing. But instead of like a 2-month period where it's really influencing on the back of their research, it's more like a year-long process where they become more of an ambassador for the organisation and they're grounded by the research that they've done. But it's no longer just about that, really. It's about kind of more broadly loads of other stuff. So this is the one I was talking about Merton Council. On the bottom left is the video, on the top right is all of their stuff that they did. And again, because they were the young inspectors based in Merton Council, they already had a role there. So once the peer research was done, we left as an organisation because we were no longer supporting the peer research. But those young inspectors continue to work at Merton Council, right? Which meant that they can continue to do some of that code delivery work and working as a practitioner, almost working with a local authority hat on, sitting in those rooms with commissioners, thinking about the strategies going ahead that they would constantly have in their back pocket. This huge piece of work that reached 2,000 young local residents, and they would bring that into every single meeting to inform the work that they're doing. Right, thanks. And this is the peer mentoring process, and you can find this in National House Project if you Google peer mentoring, where after 1 year they again wanted a mentoring process. Year 2 they co-designed and co-delivered the peer mentoring process. So they delivered what the program would look like. We were given a budget for National House Project. The peer mentors were given that budget and thought about what does a 6-week process with this budget look like, what would be useful. Then they designed all the resources and the training around it, and then the CNNM went out to different local house projects and trained up other young people to be mentors as well as being mentors themselves. Right, so it was a year-long process on the back of a research process, and it was co-designing and co-delivery. So there's a way of scaffolding the move to it, right? I've talked about it. It's about payment. So they are paid practitioners and their workers either on for payroll or freelance contract or whatever it is. Accredited training, so offering, then doing a proper youth work qualification. Accredited peer mentoring role, just giving them the qualifications is that next step up in terms of code delivery. Clinical safeguarding supervision as well, depending on what they need. The level of support changes because from a research role to being a youth worker role or whatever it is, that also changes the level of support and supervision needed. Promotion and step out roles as well, and we see this with young people where they actually want to continue doing stuff, right? Peer research is such a good experience, but how do you support them to get not just with you but other employment or education or a different role internally, and then the boundary clarity, right? And I think there's a real shift in culture where they go from a peer researcher to a peer practitioner, right? It's still kind of peer delivery, but it's not just the supervision, safeguarding, but all of their roles and responsibilities do shift as well. They have to take on more, and how does that review, and how does that build their confidence and make sure that that's done, that transition is handled nicely. There are examples of code delivery. Again, I won't go into all of them. Renee today contracted young people out as peer evaluators, and they continuously went out and evaluated the different roles and the grantees. The Mix trained young people starting online to be peer support workers. Young Minds had activists and residents, where based on the back of some research, these young people were salaried in 12-month roles for leading campaigns, thinking about organisational strategy. And it kind of gets onto what I will talk about lastly, which is kind of embedding young people in the organisation. Lastly, I'll talk about impact pot with the roots 1 and 4. So, who decides on it, typical funding scales, ring fence. This is really tricky. Not all organisations have abilities to do this, but even if you have a small grant that they could do, so they can actually have an impact pot. Sometimes the impact pot you're seeking from funders will actually just be for continual work and capacity for staff and peer researchers' time to create influence. Other times it will be a specific pot of money that they're using to enact recommendations, slightly different. But the main thing for both is ring fenced, so it is specifically post-research and post-output. There are kind of 3 levels of it. That project impact pot, where it's within your gift, you can do whatever you like with it. It sets precedent, young people have full control over it, and it depends on what they're going to find out. You have no idea what you're going to spend it on, depending on recommendations and findings. The second one is it influences the funder's priorities. So if you have that relationship with the funder and the program officer, then you're thinking about how you're influencing funding, direction, impact directly. And the last one is fully participatory, where young people do that participatory grant making, or they're young commissioners and they can design what goes on, or they can bring in their influence and their research to think about how they decide which grantees get funding as well. This is much easier one just showing you, right? I think if you want to know more about participatory grant making, there are really good funders and organisations that do this. Comic Relief have a youth-led grants program. Just London have peer researchers and young people panels where they think about commissioning priorities. In London, you've got Islington Giving as well. Local authorities also do quite a few young commissioners where young people are treated like commissioners and have to rank applications and things like that. There are really good examples of this, but they're usually quite separate from peer research. And what I think is really interesting is thinking about how you go from a peer research process into participatory grant making. This happens more within a local authority where everything's in-house anyway, so the peer researchers get recruited to be young commissioners as well, and that peer research process gives them the granting and local issues to do that peer commissioning work a little bit better. So they work really nicely jointly. And there are some examples. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip onto it, but they're pretty good if you have a look. And then lastly, social action. So social action can be so many things, right? It could be like that mutual aid or direct services where they go and organise like a food bank, community service. They do something small, immediate, but they are responsible wholly for it, and they're not reliant on waiting for anyone else to say yes. There's awareness campaigns which count as social action. They're kind of a blur between influencing as well. There's social media stuff, local events, school assemblies, and young people just be kind of publicly out there and shifting peer norms. This works particularly when one of the key people that you want to influence is other young people. That's when you do more social action style campaigning. There's peer education and training, which is similar to kind of peer delivery, but this is more about young people doing it in school. So being educators, teachers, speaking at assemblies, similar to raising awareness, but kind of translating it into action. With all social action, one of the key things is you want like a snowballing effect where, you know, young people teach other young people and those young people carry the message and it kind of builds up, right? And it's particularly true with community organizing. You want to start a petition, you want to kind of pick up traction and do more, or public meetings, or, you know, there was a group of young people that did a anti-littering thing where they went out and then tidied their local park, and it starts by just having 6 young people, and it builds up thing, and it becomes like 30 people every Saturday coming together or whatever it is, right? It builds up traction, but it started by those young people. And the policy advocates and campaigns, which we talked about already. I think, again, with all of this, it's about choosing the right format. So depending on what the findings are, it's about making sure that whatever the action is really tied to addressing that. If there's an immediate unmet need, that's probably the simplest, right? Where you do that direct service or mutual aid. If food poverty during school holidays is a big thing, then it's how do you design a food program and deliver it with young people during holiday periods, just so it's fully linked up and direct. Social action works really, really well within young people's minds when whatever they're doing so directly addresses the problem that they found, right, rather than being kind of a more complicated structural way of dealing with it. And social action works really well when it's like in person, in place, right? Well, you know, there was one social action project where the young people they had a small bit of greenery in a local authority and they didn't know what to do with it, and the young people were in charge of designing it, so they designed it within the budget and the feasibility of local authority designers. But the social action bit is they went and did it, right? They planted everything, they learned gardening skills, they got the wider community involved to help them on those certain days, right? And it became a bit of a community event. So trade-offs, you know, I talked about this next, safeguarding charitable law constraints. Charitable law constraints are particularly important as well, especially when it comes to campaigning and making sure that, you know, the political side of it, especially if you're doing it at a national level, identity protection, time and emotional cost, right? It's just, so social action is just so much more challenging in terms of making sure that it sits safely, because you're not just doing research, you might be doing anything, right? So this is the example of building a space and doing the gardening, and actually it's really wonderful because those young people can see directly the built environment around them changing as a result of their work and their research. Yeah, so that's the 5 routes, just a recap. I'm just going over time. So the last thing I'll say, and I'll just spend 5 minutes on this, is talking about embedding participation. So we talked about all of those routes to impact, and they're widely just external stakeholders, but actually the most important one that we see the most lasting legacy is when a peer research process leads to a cultural change of participation within the organisation, or it becomes a vehicle to embed participation in all the decisions an organisation makes. So it's this shift from like doing one piece of participatory work to being participatory as an organisation, right? So just doing peer research as a one-off project with a start and end, with a specific funding pot, with peer researchers exiting once it's done, you become fully participatory, right? So it's built into every single project you do. You make sure when you're applying for all different funding, there is an element of co-design or peer research or participation within it. You start to see young people get embedded across the board, you get young trustees, you make sure strategic policies are written or co-written with young people with them named as authors within it, and the operation of the organisation cannot operate with young people, right? Everything is structured and embedded as a result. And lots of organisations do this anyway, but I think it's a really good opportunity when you do a peer research process, because then you end up having 5 young people who've been trained, who've been doing the interviews, been doing the work, and they're a really nice group to kind of do a lot more of this stuff, right? So one project had peer researchers looking at some of the challenges within a youth club, and then one of the impact side of it is those peer researchers would do the interviews for new youth workers for 6 months after the research, right? So it's really about embedding their expertise that they gained from the peer research across the organisation and the different strategic decisions that it has to make on a day-to-day basis. And there are 3 ways of doing it, and this is this thing where you're converting it now from a peer research process more into a traditional youth voice structure, where those peer researchers go and become a youth advisory group and continue for a year to advise on programmes, comms and recruitment. They can become young trustees or take board member roles where they have either full voting rights or look at strategic documents and hold the organisation to account. This is particularly important if there's any recommendations that were meant for the organisation as well. You know, we had one project we spoke to where the peer researchers came up with some recommendations for the organisation. Then one of the peer researchers sat on the trustee board, but their remit within the trustee board was to make sure that the recommendations of the peer researchers were being enacted over the following year, right? Clear remit, clear role and responsibility, and that youth commissioning and decision panels as well. So this is, you know, programme priorities, partnerships as well. Also deciding what funding that we go for or don't go for, or things like that, or reviewing funding applications to make sure that the way in which we've written participation in is not tokenistic, right? There are a range of ways of doing it, but we always see peer research, we always see this, organisations that do peer research tend to have more of a participation culture as a result, right? And we don't see those peer researchers necessarily disappearing. It's about how they serve on, right? We see loads of organisations having alumni for their peer researchers and young people, right? Because they have so much participation engagement. So this is one that we have. We have a youth engagement day where we invite every single peer researcher from all the different projects who are very, very different to come together to talk about their experience on peer research, how we can improve the practice, but also thinking about strategic influencing of us as an organisation and direction. We also invite peer researchers who aren't actively involved in projects but were, you know, previously peer researchers, right? So it's a way of getting all of those young people who've been trained up, gone through a process, but also worked with different parts of the organisation, different staff members, come at it from a different kind of angle to think about and influence the overall strategy of the organisation. And it's really good because it also keeps them engaged, and it's kind of wonderful to keep in touch and see where they've gone and do some of that wonderful thing where you can see where young people have ended up employment and in terms of their employability skills. So policy changes that make participation stick. So there's a couple ones, right? Getting them involved in recruitment policy, getting them doing job interviews, getting them, you know, looking over job specifications and briefs, safeguarding policy, co-writing with young people, and making sure they check all the consent, anything that you have to do, like consent forms, information sheets, making sure that they're across that as well. Remuneration policy as well. You know, we pay London living wage, but getting them to see how that works, whether the salary system works, how that is delivered, making sure that's fine. Decision-making governance. This is when they're mostly on trustees' role, but also specific decisions delegated to peer researchers, and then learning and development policy as well. So if you're treating them as part of the workforce as well, what else do they want? Do they want accreditation, evidence, and how do we transfer that to other employment as well? So especially once they start to work with us in a bit more of a structured way, what is the employability support offer that we're giving them, and how do we get them transition from peer researcher or a, you know, practitioner embedded in the organisation to whatever career or thing that they want to do in the future. And then last thing I will say, this is really the last thing, is about retention. And the best projects we see retain peer researchers or an element of peer researchers. I'm a really big advocate for every peer research project. You should do mostly a new recruited process with the lived experience of what you're looking for. I think it becomes a bit more challenging in usual suspects if you end up recruiting a group of peer researchers and then keep doing peer research, or you retain too many of them. But I think some degree of retention is really good. Like we have a project where we had 6 peer researchers and we've got a second year which builds on the first year, and we've retained one of the peer researchers who has that kind of institutional memory, but then it's a group of fresh new young people with different lived experience for the second year's topic, right? That works really well, but otherwise other organisations will have an alumni network, right? One organisation's been doing peer evaluation or peer research for about 5 years now. So they have a huge network of peer researchers. They're not picking them to do specific peer research work, but they're keeping engaged with them and inviting them to ongoing consultation, launch events, providing guidance and mentoring to new cohorts. It's a really kind of nice way of doing it. Progression roles we talked about. Cross-organizational pool as well. Some organizations will have multiple cohorts of peer evaluators, and then that means that if they have to do a piece of evaluation work really quickly, they have a huge pool of young people to call from, which reduces recruitment. Also reduces the capacity in terms of having to train them up again, and it just means that you have a bank of young people who are trained in evaluation to do this work as well. I think that works really well for peer evaluation, but not necessarily for peer research, but peer evaluation or young commissioning or something like that works really, really well. And then lastly, progression routes about where they go, and it's just about tracking, making sure they go in direct employment, secondary school, whatever it is. And if they start their own charities, we've had peer researchers start their own charities or CICs as well. And it's just about accepting that some peer researchers will go to university and go off their lives, and they don't want to do any of this co-delivery or moving or being embedded in participation. So just recognizing that and making sure you're supporting them to where they want to go if they don't want to continue participating in the organisation. And then also evaluation participation, but we can have like another 2-hour conversation about evaluation, and I am conscious of time, but finding the impact, what happens as a result, evaluating the impact on young people specifically, what's the outcomes for them, not just in terms of skills, but also stuff like agency and belief in institutions and trust and all the things that we know that are currently missing. Organizational change is really easy. What have you done as a result? And it's also about holding yourself to account, right? In 12 months since the research, what have we changed internally as a result of this? And then quality of participation. And you can use, such as Shinner McKechnie, Lundy, Hart's Ladder, whatever it is, but how are you being reflective about your practice to make sure that all the work you're doing is fully participatory, especially when it moves on to the harder stuff, which is like, reviewing strategies internally, right? It's much easier to judge quality participation when it comes to peer research. It's less easy to do it when it's about embedded participation within internal organizational structures that aren't public facing, right? It can slip a little bit.